In the summer of 1834, the air in the Kentucky hills carried with it a stillness that many of the older folk in the township swore was not natural. The crops seemed to pause in their growth. The birds fell into an eerie silence at dusk, and even the cicadas, those relentless creatures of the southern heat, hummed with a strange irregularity. It was in this uneasy season that the Kane family, who lived on a modest plot of land outside a small settlement, prepared for the birth of twins. To most, the news of twins would have been cause for celebration, a sign of abundance and strength. But from the very beginning, the pregnancy was marked by signs that unsettled even the most practical and devout members of the community. Sarah Kane, the mother, had been plagued with dreams she refused to share in detail, though she admitted that they left her waking in a cold sweat with the image of two shadowed figures staring back at her. Neighbors claimed to hear her murmuring in the night, sometimes calling out names she had never spoken during the day. Some whispered that the pregnancy carried an ill omen, not only because of the dreams, but because the night the children came into the world, the sky was unlike anything anyone in the settlement had ever seen. A blood moon hung heavy over the hills, so large and so red that even the most hardened men looked away from it, muttering scripture under their breath. The midwife, a woman named Hester with hands roughened by years of pulling life into the world, would later tell her niece that she had never felt such dread when entering a home to deliver a child. The air was thick, she said, as if the very walls of the Kane home were watching her. The delivery itself was difficult, marked by hours of anguished cries, and at one point, Sarah seemed to slip into unconsciousness altogether, whispering the name of someone who was not in the room. Then, just as the moon reached its fullest, the first cry of an infant pierced the silence. Moments later, a second cry followed, and two identical boys were placed side by side, their small bodies shivering against the sudden chill that had swept through the cabin. From the first breath, there was something strange in the way they moved. When one turned his head, the other followed as though pulled by a hidden thread. When one balled his fist, the other's hand curled tight in perfect unison. The midwife claimed they did not cry as most infants do, but rather gave out a sound that seemed to weave together, a single cry with two voices that made the hair stand on the back of her neck. Even their eyes, still clouded by the fog of birth, seemed to search the room with an intensity unnatural for newborns. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small communities. By the following morning, the townsfolk gathered in hushed groups outside the church and in front of the trading post, speculating about what had been brought into the world under such a moon. Some insisted it was nothing more than coincidence, a strange birth, made stranger by tired superstition. Others, recalling stories passed down from their grandparents, muttered that such births under such skies were never to be trusted. They spoke of old tales of twins born under cursed stars, of bonds between siblings that blurred the line between life and death. For the Kane family, the unease of the town soon crept into their own home. Sarah, though exhausted and weakened from the delivery, could not shake the feeling that her sons were watching her with eyes too knowing. Her husband, Elias, a stern but God-fearing man, tried to dismiss her fears, yet even he felt a weight when he held the boys together. Separately, they seemed frail, as though missing something vital, but when placed side by side, their strength returned. They clutched one another's tiny fingers so tightly that Elias had to pry them apart. As the weeks passed, the twins grew, but always with the same uncanny rhythm. They cried together, slept together, and even fell ill together. The smallest cold in one boy's chest would bring fever to the other within hours. Neighbors who came to visit left with unease, remarking in whispers that the children seemed less like two souls than one divided into halves. A traveling preacher who stopped in town to deliver a sermon declared it an unnatural doubling and warned Elias that his sons were a test, perhaps even a punishment. Elias, angered, drove the man off his land, but the words lingered like a shadow that neither he nor Sarah could shake. And so, under the blood moon of 1834, the Kane twins began their lives. Born not only into the world, but into the weight of superstition, fear, and whispers that seemed destined to follow them. Those who were present at their birth could never quite explain the sensation that clung to them, a quiet dread that science could not touch, and faith dared only to name as curse. It was the beginning of a story that would leave more questions than answers, and mark the twins forever as children of an omen not even time could erase. As the twins grew beyond infancy, the strangeness that surrounded them did not fade as many had hoped, but deepened in ways that both fascinated and disturbed those who witnessed it. By the time they had reached their 3rd year, it was plain to everyone in the township that whatever bond existed between them was unlike anything that could be easily explained. Parents in the settlement often remarked that siblings had their own sort of secret language, a private way of communicating in half-formed words or gestures that only they seemed to understand. But in the case of the Kane twins, it was not merely a shared language. It was as though the two minds had been folded into one. The first sign came with their speech. When one began to form a word, his brother would complete it, the syllables flowing seamlessly from one mouth to the other until the thought was fully spoken. At first, Elias and Sarah told themselves it was simply mimicry, the natural trick of twins who spent all their time together, yet the pattern never broke. It was not mimicry at all, but a perfect division of expression, as though one mind required 2 mouths to make itself known. By the time they were 5, the effect was even more unsettling. They could carry on conversations in this fragmented manner, one starting and the other finishing, without hesitation, without confusion, and always with an eerie precision. Those who heard it said it was like listening to an echo that spoke before the original sound had finished. It was not only in speech that this uncanny connection revealed itself. Pain and sensation seemed to pass between them, without obstacle. On one occasion, Sarah witnessed one twin trip on a root in the yard, scraping his knee badly enough to draw blood. Before she could reach him, the other boy, who had been standing across the yard with a toy in his hand, let out a sharp cry and collapsed, clutching his own leg, though it bore no injury. When Sarah knelt to comfort the fallen child, both of them whimpered in the same rhythm, as though the wound belonged to them equally. The same would occur with illnesses. When one suffered a fever, the other burned with heat within the hour. No doctor in the region could make sense of it, though each left shaking his head, muttering words like sympathy and imagination, as if repeating them could wash away the truth of what they had seen. The Kane home became a place of quiet dread. Elias grew stern with his sons, trying to force individuality upon them, separating them in chores and play, even in sleep. But no matter how he tried, the boys seemed bound by something invisible and immutable. When placed in separate rooms, they grew restless and pale, calling for one another in soft voices until finally reunited. If forced to work apart, their hands shook with weakness, and more than once Elias returned to find them standing side by side again, having abandoned his commands without a word. Sarah, though torn by worry, could not bear to see them suffer the separation, and it was she who quietly undid her husband's strict rules, slipping them back into the same bed at night, where they clung together until morning. The neighbors, meanwhile, could not help but notice the strangeness whenever the boys appeared in public. At church, they knelt in unison, their hands clasping and releasing the pew rail at the same moment. When asked to recite verses, they would answer as one, alternating lines without pause, as if reading from the same page, though no book lay before them. Other children found them unnerving. Some whispered that if you looked into their eyes too long, you could no longer tell which boy you were seeing, for their expressions shifted together, two masks changing with a single hidden thought. By the time they reached the age of 7, darker stories began to circulate. A farmhand claimed he had seen the boys standing in the field at dawn, their small bodies outlined by mist, and swore they spoke without moving their lips, carrying on a conversation he could hear in his head though he was 50 yards away. A woman who lived nearby told of a night when her infant cried and would not sleep until she carried him outside, where she found the Kane twins standing silently at the edge of her yard. When she demanded what they were doing, they gave no answer, but her child went quiet the instant she brought him near them. She said their gaze was not malicious, but too knowing, too old for boys of that age. The most troubling events were those in which their bond seemed to touch the lives of others. A neighbor's daughter fell ill, and one of the Kane twins, no one remembered which, sat by her bed for hours without speaking. The next morning, the girl's fever had broken, but the boy himself lay pale and weak for days, as though the sickness had passed into him instead. Though this should have brought gratitude, it only deepened the unease surrounding them. What kind of children could take on the suffering of others and carry it as if it were their own? And if they could do such things, what else might they be capable of? Even Elias, who had resisted superstition all his life, began to falter in his certainty. He had once believed he could shape his sons through discipline, but he now saw in their every glance that something larger than fatherly authority bound them. He took to drinking in the evenings, muttering at the fire that perhaps the preacher had been right. Perhaps they were not a blessing, but a trial placed upon his house. Sarah, though frightened, clung to them with a kind of desperate devotion. She insisted that whatever their strangeness, they were still her boys, and she would not see them treated as cursed things. Yet even she could not shake the feeling, when they turned their twin gazes upon her, that they knew her thoughts before she spoke them. The community, once merely curious, began to grow suspicious. Some families discouraged their children from playing with the twins, fearing what might be learned or shared in their company. Others whispered that the odd misfortunes that had begun to plague the town, milk spoiling too soon, livestock growing ill, strange noises in the woods, were somehow connected to the boys. No proof was ever offered, but in such a place and time, whispers carried more weight than reason, and soon the twins were regarded with a mixture of fascination and fear. And through it all, the bond between them only grew stronger. It was not a matter of closeness, nor even of love, as most siblings share, but of an entanglement so complete that the idea of them as two separate beings seemed false. They were not brothers in the ordinary sense, but halves of something whole, existing in a way that blurred the boundary between one body and the other. It was a truth that unsettled even those who tried to explain it away with science or faith, because no explanation could touch the heart of what they had witnessed. And though the Kane family tried to carry on as best they could, the sense lingered that the boys were bound for something neither their parents nor their community could prepare for. It was this bond, uncanny and unbroken, that would one day turn tragedy into horror, when life itself proved incapable of severing it. By the time the Kane twins reached their 9th year, the strangeness of their bond had become woven into the fabric of life in the township. Most had learned to avoid speaking of it openly, though behind closed doors, stories of the boys passed in hushed tones, as if their very names carried weight. For the Kane family, the boys were simply themselves, uncanny though they might be, but for the wider community, it had become harder to ignore the pattern of events that seemed to follow wherever they went. At first, it was small things, a broken tool, a patch of blighted corn, milk turning sour in the pail. Such misfortunes were not uncommon in the hard life of the Kentucky hills, but soon the timing became too precise, too uncanny for comfort. It began in earnest with the livestock. One autumn morning, a neighbor's prized mare was found dead in its stall, the body twisted in a way that suggested violence, but left no clear mark of predator or man. Not long after, a farmer reported his hens lying lifeless, with no wounds upon them, as though some unseen sickness had claimed them all in a single night. Rumors spread quickly, and soon the township was filled with whispers of animals found mutilated or inexplicably dead. The one detail that drew the stories together was not what was found, but when each incident occurred on the same nights that one or both of the twins fell ill with sudden fevers or fainting fits. Sarah, desperate to shield her sons from suspicion, tried to keep them at home during such times, nursing them through their strange ailments in the dim light of the cabin. But even in their confinement, the marks of unease appeared elsewhere. Barn doors were discovered with crude symbols etched into the wood. Circles intersected by jagged lines, spirals carved as though with small hands. No one could explain how they came to be, yet they appeared most often when the twins' sickness was at its worst. A few claimed to have seen the boys wandering at night in their feverish state, but when confronted, the children denied it, their wide eyes showing no trace of deceit. The township's children began to tell stories of their own. They spoke of voices that whispered from the woods at dusk, calling them by name, urging them to step beyond the safety of the yard. Some said the voices were playful, others that they were mocking, and a few swore they had heard the voices come in pairs, one light and one dark, overlapping in eerie harmony. On more than one occasion, a child returned home pale and shaken, insisting he had seen the twins standing at the edge of the trees, even though Elias swore his sons had not left the house. Whether these were childish fancies or something more sinister, the effect was the same. The other families began keeping their children close, and the Kane boys were left to wander together, isolated by the very bond that defined them. Even among adults, there were encounters that deepened the sense of dread. A woman named Abigail, known for a sharp tongue and sharper suspicions, reported waking one night to a scratching at her window. She claimed she rose to look, expecting to find a stray branch tapping against the glass, but instead saw two pale faces staring in at her, identical and unblinking. Yet when her husband rushed outside, there was nothing there, only footprints in the dirt that seemed too small to belong to grown men, but too numerous to belong to only two children. The following day, she pointed an accusing finger at the Kane twins, insisting it had been them, though no proof could be found. The tension grew heavier with each incident, and the divide between the Kane family and the rest of the township widened. Elias held firm against the mounting suspicion, though his temper grew shorter with every whisper he overheard. He insisted, to those who dared confront him, that boys were boys, that misfortunes came to every farm, and that the strange illnesses of his sons were no more than the will of Providence. Yet even as he spoke, doubt flickered in his own eyes. He had seen the way his sons' fevers seemed to rise with unnatural force, their bodies racked with shivers while their skin burned to the touch. He had seen them whispering together in the dark, lips moving in silence, their expressions too solemn for children. And he had heard the way the house itself seemed to groan when they lay sick, as if the timbers strained under some unseen weight. Sarah, though more tender, was no less troubled. She prayed nightly for her boys, asking God to protect them from the judgments of others. But in the deepest part of her heart, she wondered if they truly belonged to any protection she could summon. She would sit by their bedside when they burned with fever and watch as their hands twitched in perfect unison, fingers curling and uncurling as though grasping for something unseen. Sometimes they whispered in their half-sleep, voices overlapping in a cadence that made no sense to her but seemed to carry the rhythm of speech. On one such night, she swore she heard her own name spoken, followed by a laugh that belonged to neither child. The community's fear hardened into avoidance. Fewer came to trade with Elias, and Sarah's once friendly neighbors found reasons to stay away. At church, the twins were watched with wary eyes, and when they knelt to pray, a space formed around them as though even piety could not bridge the distance between themselves and the others. The preacher, who had once warned Elias of unnatural doubling, now spoke more cautiously, hinting in sermons of hidden sins, of the dangers of ignoring signs sent from above. His words were never pointed directly at the Canes, but the congregation understood the message well enough. The boys themselves seemed both unaware and curiously aware of their effect on those around them. They did not flinch from the stares, nor did they complain of loneliness. They had one another, and that seemed enough. Yet sometimes, when they thought no one was watching, their play would take on a strange, ritualistic quality. They would draw shapes in the dirt with sticks, not childish scribbles, but precise patterns, repeating them over and over until interrupted. When asked what they were doing, they would shrug and say nothing, though their eyes betrayed a knowing they could not or would not share. It was in these years that the township's unease hardened into the conviction that something unnatural lived in the bond between the twins. For all the talk of fever, coincidence, and childish imagination, there were too many stories, too many shadows, for the community to dismiss. Each unexplained sound, each sudden loss, each half-heard whisper seemed to lead back, in one way or another, to the Cane boys, and though no proof ever rose to condemn them, no explanation could absolve them either. The disturbances in the community became less like isolated incidents and more like a pattern that everyone could feel but no one could name. A pattern tied to the twins, as though whatever thread bound them together was slowly stretching outward, weaving itself into the lives of others, leaving behind only fear. It was the fear that lingered, unspoken but heavy, that would soon turn to grief when tragedy struck, proving that the bond the twins carried was not only strange but fatal. The year 1843 arrived with an unusual bitterness in the air. Winter had pressed itself into the hills of Kentucky with a weight that seemed to seep into the marrow of its people. Families huddled close to fires, rationed their stores, and prayed for the thaw that always came too slow. Yet for the Cane household, that year's cold marked more than just hardship. It became the stage for the tragedy that no one in the township could ever fully comprehend. The moment when the strange bond of the twins revealed itself in its most horrifying form. The boys were 9 years old then, lean and restless, their dark eyes carrying the same shared intensity that had unsettled neighbors since their birth. Though whispers about them had not faded, people had grown accustomed to their presence, if only because strangeness becomes, with time, a dull part of the landscape. But that winter brought with it not only biting winds and sicknesses that spread quickly through the settlement. It brought a lingering sense that the fragile balance around the Cane family was about to break. It began one evening when one of the twins, whichever of the two it was hardly mattered anymore to those around them, complained of a sharp pain in his chest. Sarah, ever watchful, sat him by the fire, wrapping him in blankets and pressing her palm to his brow. His skin was cool, yet his eyes darted wildly as though something unseen gnawed at him from within. The other boy sat close at his side, his expression taut, as if he too felt the pain despite showing no outward sign. Elias dismissed it at first, saying boys often complained in winter, their bodies restless with the confinement of long nights indoors. But Sarah knew better. She had seen too many fevers shared between them, too many nights when one's sickness passed like a shadow into the other, to believe it was only fuss. By midnight, the sick boy grew pale, his breathing shallow, each exhale rattling as though his lungs were filled with stones. Sarah sent Elias to fetch the doctor from the neighboring settlement. But before he could return, the boy's small body stiffened. His brother cried out at the same instant, falling back from the chair as if struck by the same unseen force. Sarah rushed to one, then to the other, her mind tearing itself in two with panic. But her hands could not cover both at once, and her voice could not soothe them together, though both seemed to suffer in equal measure. Neighbors later said they heard the wails that night, sounds that did not belong to a single child but to two, rising and falling in unison, echoing like one voice split apart. By the time Elias returned with the doctor, one of the twins had grown still, his chest unmoving, his eyes half-lidded in the pale light of the fire. No warmth came from his skin when Sarah touched him, no stir of breath beneath her desperate hands. The doctor could only bow his head, for there was nothing in his training to bring back what had already left. Yet what chilled every soul in that cabin was not the death of one child, but the fate of the other. At the very moment his brother's breath ceased, the living boy collapsed unconscious, his body falling limp as though struck dead himself. But he still breathed, faint and uneven, his pulse weak beneath trembling fingers. His face bore no fever, no mark of illness, but his skin paled to the same shade as his twins, and his limbs twisted in the same final posture. He remained in that death-like state for hours, neither waking nor stirring, as though tethered to the silent body beside him. Sarah would not allow them to take the dead boy away, not while the other hovered between life and something else. She clutched both of them in her arms, rocking them together as though they were newborns again, her tears falling so freely that her voice cracked into silence. Elias, hardened by grief he could not express, kept vigil by the window with his jaw clenched tight, his knuckles white on the wood of the sill. The doctor, unnerved beyond his ability to reason, muttered about sympathy of nerves, the fragile connection of twins, but none in that room believed it was so simple. When morning came, the still boy was prepared for burial, though Sarah begged for more time. The living twin stirred at last, gasping awake with a cry that echoed the sound of the one who could no longer speak. He clutched his chest and looked wildly about the room, as though searching for something that had been torn from him. When his eyes fell on the lifeless form beside him, his face contorted with a grief far too raw for words. He reached for his brother's hand and would not release it until he was pulled away by Elias's steady shaking grip. What followed deepened the mystery in ways that no one in the township could explain. When the funeral came, the living boy refused to speak, his lips sealed in silence as if words had abandoned him along with his brother. But when the coffin was lowered into the earth, he screamed, a sound so piercing that even the preacher faltered in his scripture. Later that night, Sarah swore she found him sitting upright in bed, whispering in the dark with a voice that was not his own. She could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, the inflection, the rhythm, the pauses. It was his brother's voice speaking through his mouth. In the weeks that followed, the surviving twin seemed to wither under the weight of something unseen. He walked as though carrying another's steps, often stumbling, often pausing in mid-motion, as though waiting for someone who was no longer there. More than once, Sarah found him staring into mirrors, tilting his head at angles his reflection did not match. He began to speak again, but not in his own manner. Instead, he carried on conversations as though two voices were braided into one, sometimes overlapping, sometimes alternating, until Sarah fled the room with terror in her eyes. For the community, the tragedy confirmed their fears. What had been suspicion now hardened into belief, that the Kane twins were bound by something unnatural, something no sickness or prayer could explain. Some said the dead boy had not truly gone, but lingered inside his brother, clinging to him in a bond that even death could not sever. Others whispered that the survivor was no longer a child at all, but a vessel for two souls, cursed to carry what should have been buried. No one dared say such things to Elias or Sarah, but the air around the family grew colder, the distance greater, until the Kanes were as isolated as if they lived a mile deeper into the woods. The tragedy of that night did not simply rob them of one son. It revealed to everyone that what had seemed a strange closeness was in truth something darker, something beyond the reach of explanation. And though the earth closed over one boy's body, the township could not shake the feeling that both still walked among them, inseparable, unseen, yet undeniable. It was only the first tragedy, but not the last, for the bond of the Kane twins had proven stronger than death itself. The death of one twin should have brought closure, as painful as it was, yet what followed unsettled the township far more deeply than the tragedy itself. Death, after all, is a known thing, a sorrow carried by every family in time. But what began to take shape in the years after that cold winter of 1843 was something that slipped beyond grief and into a realm where neither faith nor reason could offer comfort. For the surviving Kane boy, life did not continue as it ought to have. It warped, darkened, and became the vessel of something that seemed to belong not only to him, but to the brother buried beneath the Kentucky soil. In the first months following the burial, the boy hardly spoke. He moved through the house in silence, his steps soft, his eyes shadowed. Elias tried to rouse him with work, forcing tools into his small hands and commanding him to join in the labor of the farm. But the boy's strength seemed to fail him. He would wander away from his chores, standing in fields as though listening to a voice carried by the wind. Sarah tried to draw him close, but even she admitted that when he looked at her, there were times she saw not her living son, but the memory of the one she had lost, as though the gaze of the grave peered out through his eyes. By summer, he began to speak again, but not in the way of a child. His words were slow, heavy, and often doubled in tone. Sometimes his lips would move, and another voice, hollow, strained, seemed to accompany his own, as if two speakers had pressed themselves into a single throat. The first time it happened, Sarah froze in place, her blood running cold. Elias dismissed it as imagination. But he too heard it in the nights that followed, when the boy whispered in his sleep, carrying on conversations that sounded like replies to questions no one had asked. At times he laughed in the darkness, and the laughter was unmistakably the rhythm and pitch of the twin who had been buried months before. What shook the family most were the memories. The living boy began to recount moments that belonged to his brother alone. He spoke of climbing the oak tree in the neighbor's yard, though he himself had never dared ascend it. He recalled losing a button from a coat on the far side of the pasture, though Sarah remembered plainly that it had been the other boy who had come home missing it. His words slipped into the first person, describing events as though he had lived them, though Sarah knew with certainty that he had not. At first she tried to correct him, gently reminding him of what had truly happened. But he would grow frustrated, even angry, insisting that he remembered it exactly as he said. Soon Sarah stopped correcting him altogether, afraid of what it meant to tell her son he was wrong when he seemed to speak with another's voice. It was not only his speech that drew whispers. People began to claim they saw him in two places at once. A farmer swore he spotted the boy walking past his fence at dusk, only to find him sitting silently on the steps of the Kane cabin minutes later. A woman insisted she saw him standing by the churchyard gate, though Elias said he had not left the house all day. The preacher himself once stopped mid-sermon, his eyes fixed on the pew where the boy sat, for he swore he saw a shadow sitting beside him, moving when he moved, lifting its head when he did. The congregation fell into a hush that never quite lifted, and from then on, the Kane boy sat alone, space widening around him as though no one dared draw too near. As the months turned into years, the haunting grew more undeniable. Sarah awoke one night to find her son standing at the foot of her bed, his face pale in the moonlight, whispering in that doubled voice. His words made no sense, but she swore she heard the names of people long dead, names her son could not have known. Another night, Elias rose to the sound of footsteps in the hall, heavy as a man's. When he opened the door, he found the boy standing with his back to him, but the sound of the steps still echoed as though another figure had only just vanished into the dark. Elias, who had resisted fear longer than most, fell silent in his suspicions after that, taking to prayer with a fervor that unsettled even Sarah. Neighbors avoided the Kane farm whenever possible, though their reasons shifted with the telling. Some claimed the boy could see into their thoughts, that when his eyes lingered on them, their secrets rose unbidden to the surface of their minds. Others said he carried misfortune with him, for any house he visited soon suffered some small calamity: spilled milk, broken tools, sick animals. Children refused to play with him, some crying when he drew near, others running at the sound of his approach. It was as though grief had not simply marked him, but transformed him into something other, something that unsettled the very air around him. Sarah tried to protect him, to shelter him from the cruel whispers, but she too could not deny the truth of what she saw. At times, when the boy sat by the fire, she could swear his shoulders shifted, his posture bending into the shape of his brother. Once she glanced up from her sewing to find two boys sitting where there should have been one, their faces turned in perfect unison. Though when she blinked, only her son remained. She told herself it was exhaustion, that grief had twisted her senses, but deep inside she knew she had glimpsed what others only whispered. The boy himself seemed torn between awareness and ignorance. He never admitted outright that his brother still lingered within him, but neither did he deny it. Sometimes he spoke of we rather than I, his words betraying a doubling he could not suppress. Other times he seemed frightened by his own body, clutching at his chest or his hands, as though they belonged to someone else, yet when asked directly, he would only fall silent, his gaze fixed on the ground, his lips pressed tight. It became clear to everyone that the tragedy had not ended with the burial. The dead twin had not left, not in the way that death demands. He lingered, woven into the surviving boy, pressing his presence into every word, every step, every shadow. Whether it was possession, memory, or something no one had the language to name, the effect was the same. The boy was no longer wholly himself. He had become the bearer of two lives, two voices, two identities, walking in a single, frail body. And so what should have been the slow fading of grief became instead a new terror for the Kane family and for the community around them. The haunting was not of the house nor of the land, but of the living child who carried death within him, who blurred the boundary between what was gone and what remained. It was this torment, this unsettling truth, that would reach its breaking point in his 17th year, when disappearance and blood left the township with a mystery no grave could contain. The boy who had carried his brother's shadow through childhood reached his 17th year with a silence about him that none could pierce. He had grown tall but gaunt, his face sharpened by years of sleepless nights, and whispers spoken in voices not wholly his own. By then, the township no longer treated him as simply strange. They regarded him as something set apart, a figure to be avoided. Children crossed to the other side of the road when they saw him approach, and neighbors who once offered polite greetings now muttered only prayers under their breath. Even Elias, worn thin with age and drink, kept distance from his son, while Sarah clung desperately to him, convinced that if she let him slip from her sight, she would lose both her boys forever. It was in the spring of 1851 when the end came, and the story of the Kane twins turned into something no family, no preacher, and no doctor could explain. One morning, Sarah entered her son's room to wake him, only to find the bedclothes twisted and damp with blood. The boy was gone. The window, though latched from the inside, bore streaks of crimson along the frame, as though something, or someone, had pressed against it with wounded hands. Panic spread quickly, and Elias gathered neighbors to search the woods that bordered the Kane farm. What they found was no ordinary trail. Blood drops led from the house into the trees, not in a scatter, but in a steady line, almost deliberate, as though marked for following. The men who tracked it claimed the woods were unnaturally still, their footfalls muffled, the air heavy with the smell of iron. The trail wound deeper, past the creek and into the thickets, until at last it opened into a clearing just as dawn broke. And there, silhouetted against the rising light, two figures were seen. The first was the living twin, his pale body hunched, his face streaked with what seemed like tears of blood. The second, impossible yet undeniable, was his brother, the one buried nearly a decade before standing beside him. They were not distant, hazy apparitions, but solid forms, walking together slowly as if they had never been parted. Witnesses later swore that the two boys glanced back only once, their faces unreadable, their movements in perfect unison, before turning again and vanishing into the mist of the forest. No body was ever recovered. The trail of blood ended in that clearing, and though men searched for days, calling the boy's name until their voices broke, not a trace was found. The grave of the first twin was opened in secret by a few who hoped to find answers, but the body lay untouched, still and silent in its coffin, bones wrapped in the same shroud laid there years before. Yet the witnesses clung to their story with a trembling certainty, that they had seen both brothers alive, or what could only be called alive, walking side by side as though death had no claim upon them. The Kane household fell silent after that. Elias withdrew into bitterness, seldom seen beyond the farm, while Sarah withered into grief, clinging to the faint hope that her sons might return. The community spoke of the mystery only in whispers, each retelling marked with unease, for the tale carried a weight that no one wished to bear too long. Some believed the twins had been claimed by something otherworldly, a force neither holy nor earthly that had bound them together from birth. Others believed they had never truly been two boys at all. But one soul split across two bodies, finally drawn back into a unity beyond mortal sight. Whatever the truth, it was never spoken aloud in church nor written in any town record. It lived only in the memories of those who had seen the impossible with their own eyes, And in the shiver that passed through the township each spring dawn, when the mist rose from the woods and the light fell just so as if two shadows still walked together beyond the edge of sight. It was the unspeakable end of the Kane twins and the beginning of a mystery that not even science could explain.